Like, oh, we really have to go through this every single time. Oh, I'm wearing black today. It's slimming. You got your sock situation figured out, I see.
I meant to wear white socks.
It's like a running joke.
Yeah.
Your outfit just gets progressively worse. Every week.
Show up with a ketchup stain one week.
Start growing like a neck beard.
Yeah. Just the neck.
Hello and welcome to the EmberMap podcast, where we discuss design and development in the world of Ember.js. I'm Sam.
I'm Ryan.
And if you like what you hear today, you can find more of our work on EmberMap.com.
What do we got going on this week?
What do we got going on this week? We are going to talk about some Storefront stuff. We're going to talk about some FastBoot stuff.
JSON API operations.
JSON API operations. Let's start with that.
Okay.
Because I don't know much about this. So.
Cool. Well, you do know the problems.
I know the problem, so let's talk about the problem. So JSON API, we've been using that for a long time now. It's become the de facto standard in Ember. And it's basically ended up crystallizing a lot of the patterns that we were all familiar with from pre-JSON API, JSON APIs. Side note, JSON API is the worst name of all time because you don't know if you're talking about JSON APIs or JSON API.
Or you tell someone, like, we use JSON API, and they're like, yeah, we've been using it for years. And you're like, no, JSON API.
You don't understand. You gotta join the club to know what we're talking about.
Right.
So it really crystallized. Its main focus was on relationship graphs in a single payload. I think that's how you could sum up.
That's like your biggest benefit.
That's my biggest benefit, like separating attributes and relationships and having a consistent way for both people and, more importantly, machines to be able to look at a JSON API document, a JSON object, and be able to cross-reference everything in the payload for the purposes of moving it into an identity store on a client side. That's kind of what Dan said was the motivation. Like, this should be the goal of most clients when they're requesting data, is like you have a local cache of data for your app. And if you request things over time and some of them map to the same entities, you want to know that.
And this format's perfect.
Perfect for that. So one of the things that, again, it's kind of like everything in Ember, where we get a solution and it puts us on the 10th floor, and then we can see from up here and we're like, I want to go to the 15th floor.
Yeah, we can see the 15th floor. We can't get there,
exactly.
But we can see it.
Whereas before we didn't even know this was a problem.
Yeah, so operation support, one of the problems that we run into in every app we work on is we have a graph of objects that we want to save. And there's no way to save an entire graph. You basically save graphs. You save objects one at a time.
Right, so gets work great. Get, if I want to get author and all their posts and all the author's post comments, boom, you get a compound document with all the information. But if you wanted to save that same exact graph, there's no way to do that right now.
So examples like, you want to save an order with multiple line items, and if any part of that fails, like the order fails or the line items fails, you just want the whole thing to be one big transaction, and the whole thing just rolls back if any piece fails. Right now we have no way to do that, and like in our apps we call it the waterfall.
Yeah.
Where we save one, save the next one, save the next one.
And that's just so that we can keep our backends dumb and conventional.
Yeah.
Because it lets us do something that requires a lot of these operations without changing the backend code. Now, if we were building something like Trello, we would probably change that criteria. I guess it depends on what you're building, right?
Yeah, it's a really good point.
But if you wanted to drag a card from here to here, from one list to the next, you're affecting the positions of all the cards below it, let's say, and all the cards below the thing you're just dragging it to, and the list property of the card. So if you were to do that in atomic operations, it could be like...
Yeah, you could have like 30 patch requests.
Exactly. And if one of them fails, now your app is in a weird state, so that's basically would be off the table.
Yep. So the solution to this is a pull request called JSON API operations. And it's a format for the JSON API document where you can specify multiple operations in a single request. It's always a patch request. In a single patch request. And the idea is the server will run these operations in order, and if any of them fail, it tells you. But the idea is you can give in a single HTTP request, you can give your backend multiple things to do.
So the single request that you send to your backend is a patch request.
Yep.
But the operations you're performing that you're grouping don't necessarily have to be patches.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think there's 4 different operations. There's get, create, update, and delete. And I think they have different terms. So I think get is one, maybe add, remove, and update.
Or destroy or something.
Destroy, yeah, something. I forget what it is. But the idea is those are the 4 types of operations you can do.
So what would it look like to do like when would get be bundled in? I guess do the gets determine what the response is?
Yeah, no, they don't. Well, they would, right? Because if you're getting multiple things, I think it would affect the response. I don't know. So when I was reading this part of the spec, I don't know when I've ever needed to do multiple gets that I couldn't do with includes.
Right.
But this might just be something where, like, since we're doing it for put and pat for create and update,
we want to make it generic.
Yeah. I was trying to think through this, like, when would I use this? And maybe I'm building like I have a homepage.
Well, I was about to say that, like the
homepage
EmberMap homepage that we're talking about building, which would be
a blog feed, a video feed, and then so I could say I could do an operation that gets me all the blog posts and all the video posts.
That would be awesome.
Yeah,
because then you would keep those backend controllers in your API dumb, and you wouldn't need, like we're talking about. So to set some context for the listeners, right now the homepage of EmberMap.com is an example of a kind of a media site that has a feed of information. And the feed is a list of homogeneous models. They're all posts or postables. And so it's easy for us to make a conventional API endpoint and say, give me all the postables, the latest 10, let's say. And what we're talking about doing is making something more, if you imagine like Netflix.com or like the Netflix Apple TV app where you have new and noteworthy, or you have like our favorites. And these things are all the same types, but you can imagine you would need different requests to get the data. And what you could do is kind of make a new API endpoint that's like a homepage posts controller.
Give me all the ribbons, and those ribbons would be
include
new
the videos.
Noteworthy,
exactly.
And then you would include the videos.
And that would keep it kind of like the way we're used to, but you can tell that's like maybe unnecessary in the way that you're talking about it.
It's almost like our UI is affecting the data modeling.
Right.
Right. And I don't know if that's necessarily bad,
right.
But is that a good thing? Like
if you could avoid it, and so if you could say, you have these 4 requests, it would be a bummer to have to do them separately and use like RSVP hash, and like what if one of them fails? What you really want is to load all of them together. Yeah. So if you could do that in a JSON API, like compound request or an operation, I guess it's called, then that would be better. So that's pretty cool.
It's funny, but the real reason this excites us is definitely the
CRUD
creation.
side.
Yeah,
right.
The CRUD, the creation, the updates, and the deletes.
Right. So that's going to let us do things like, when you sign up and you need to create a user and a team, you can do it all in one go. Yeah. And this doesn't put your app in multiple states. It's just either all fails or all succeeds. And it super simplifies things. Yep. So that's really cool. So he's been working on this, apparently. We didn't really know about it, or...
There's been a whole lot of different efforts I know some other folks have come up with like their own homegrown solutions here. So like there's this idea of like side posting, which is like side loading, but on the posting side. And I think there's been a couple issues in the JSON API repo that outline different ways to solve this. But I think this is kind of Dan saying, okay, I've read everything, I've thought about this.
Nice.
Here's what I think the best path forward is.
And he got some funding from Prototypal.
Yeah.
Eric Brin's company.
Yep.
So that's awesome.
Yeah.
I mean, because Dan, every time Dan touches open source,
good things happen.
Yeah, exactly. Good things happen. He's got the Midas touch when it comes to that stuff. I feel like once he attacks a problem, whatever solution comes out, we're going to use it. So that's great that they were able to fund him and he was able to get some time to finish that. So
yeah.
So he worked on the spec.
Yeah, I think right now it's just an outline. So right now it's what you would see if you went to JSONAPI.org and you clicked like, format or specification or whatever that link is. So he wrote that as, from the reader's point of view.
But they also implemented it in JSON API resources?
No. This is just kind of him
laying
writing
the groundwork.
The spec, right. Getting the spec out.
You would imagine if they are happy with it soon, they would have a feature branch or something in JSON API resource where we could try it out.
Yeah, and I'm sure, I'm not gonna, say that they're doing things they're
Yeah.
not, but I'm sure that when they're thinking through this, they're also thinking, okay, how would this work in Ember Data? How would this work in JSON API resources?
In Orbit. Yeah, totally. That's really cool.
Yeah, super excited.
Nice. Let's talk about FastBoot.
Yeah, my favorite subject.
Your favorite subject. There's always some new wrinkle to talk about when it comes to FastBoot.
Yeah.
It's not, like we were saying this week, it's not so much FastBoot as it is the problem space that FastBoot helps you define and
I
understand.
mean, I don't know, is FastBoot so difficult because FastBoot got something wrong and there's some bad abstractions in there, or is FastBoot difficult because you're trying to generate a client-side application in the server to get something painted on the screen really quickly? Like, I think there's just a lot of complexity that comes with FastBoot. And no matter, even with like the perfect FastBoot APIs and abstractions, there's still a lot of complexity there. Right.
So what was the context in which your FastBoot work came up in?
Yeah, so we've been working on Ember Data Storefront, which is a way for us to be smarter about querying our backend for data. And in that, we use store.query. We basically use store.query and cache the query. So if you ever rerun a query with like the same includes or the same filters, we can just give you that result right away. Mm-hmm. So we end up in the situation where when we run our FastBoot app and it does a bunch of store.queries, it now has like HTML that it ships to the client. Mm-hmm. The client renders that HTML, but then the Ember app on the client boots up and takes over, and it's going to rerun those same store.queries. Mm-hmm. And
now, okay, so would it, if let's just say we were using vanilla Ember Data find record, would it rerun the find record?
There is, so for find record, no. There's an add-on called Ember Data FastBoot. I think that's it. Some combination of those words. It will, it will take your store generated from FastBoot and put it in the shoebox. And then when the client boots up, the client will load that shoebox data into its store. So things like find record will just
behave the way they would as if you were running find record with a store in that data. But again, for the same reasons that we made Storefront in the first place, the data in the store is not always enough to know the behavior you want.
Exactly. And store.query, again, doesn't care what's in the store. It's always going to go off and do a fetch.
Right. Which
is
why Storefront has its own simple caching layer for remembering queries.
So if you were using this Ember Data FastBoot add-on, it would work for find record, but it wouldn't work for store.query. Find all behavior would be, if you have data in the store, you would get it, but that might not always be the data you want.
Right.
So the problem we want to solve is if I run a query on FastBoot and I'm giving this page to my client, I don't need my client to rerun these queries.
Right.
So that was a FastBoot work.
How was it?
It was good. I'm also doing some other stuff, but for this problem, I think there were enough add-ons out there that I could copy, look at what they're doing, come up with a similar approach.
You use the shoebox.
The shoebox approach. So we don't actually cache like anything storefront related. Mm-hmm. We look at all the queries you ran in FastBoot and we cache them at like the adapter layer, so at like the URL layer, and then we give them all. We put that in the shoebox, give the shoebox to the client.
But the URL and the data.
The URL and the data. So then the client runs and the client makes a request to a URL and we check the shoebox. If it's in the shoebox, we just give them that data. And then we do something where we immediately delete it from the shoebox so that like in 5 minutes later, if your client re-requests that data, we're not just going to keep giving you shoebox data.
Right. It's for the initial run. It's for the first paint of your app.
Exactly. And if you think about it, like that shoebox is going to then be emptied within like a few seconds.
Right.
Because it's just for that initial thing.
After the initial render, basically.
Yeah, it should be empty.
It should be empty.
Not.
Because the purpose is not to be a cache for your app. It's just to recreate, to save it from doing some unnecessary work that it already did on the server.
Right. Exactly. And where this really bit us, the whole reason we went down this road. Let's imagine that you run store.query on the server, ship a bunch of like pre-rendered HTML to the client shows that, then runs store.query again, and then renders that result. Like the user shouldn't see any change because even though, like, sure, it was inefficient. You ran a query once on the server, once on the client, but that query isn't going to change between that window there.
Right.
The problem is with loading templates. So store.query goes into a loading state. That's going to render.
So you see the content, then you see the loading and then you see the content again.
So the loading template piece really bites you.
I see. But that was actually good that it brought the issue to light.
Yes.
Because
we probably wouldn't have cared.
Because it was fast enough or just didn't even think about it.
Yep.
And we definitely don't want to be changing application code. Like ideally, if you're using Storefront the way we suggest and you add this FastBoot feature, like you shouldn't have to recode your application logic to account for whether my app is being rendered, whether this route is being rendered from a FastBoot load or from a transition from another page on the client.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%.
So it's not like, oh, I can check if it's in FastBoot, and if not, we won't render the loading spinner.
Right, because then you could introduce a bug that only shows up in FastBoot.
Exactly.
It's like kind of having like if-is test in your code.
Exactly.
It's just like an opportunity to enter a bug that's not actually run when it's in like the other environments.
Exactly.
So,
we also kind of talked a bit about how, again, like which classes of pages in an Ember app are more suitable for rendering with FastBoot and also caching. So maybe we can kind of talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so I kind of mentioned a little earlier, I was also doing some other stuff. So this is
the caching stuff.
Is we want to, right now we only serve FastBoot to bots.
The reason we originally added FastBoot to EmberMap was because we wanted cards on Twitter and Slack to show up.
Right, but it turns out that FastBoot, can be pretty good because the user doesn't have to boot a whole Ember app.
Right.
So it'd be awesome to get it to a point where all users see a FastBoot app.
But the reason we didn't have FastBoot from the beginning serving all requests is because as much as the ecosystem attempts to make a fast-booted Ember app a high-fidelity version of your client-rendered Ember app, there are differences. There's enough differences in a variety of ways that we felt it was safer to just start with a one case, right? Because there's enough little knife edges.
Right. I'm also like a really big fan of like progressive rollouts.
Yeah.
So I'd rather test something like FastBoot, which is like pretty
big architectural change.
Yeah. And also people weren't doing this, 10 years ago.
Right.
There's not a lot of history here.
Right.
Definitely want to test on a smaller set.
Right.
But we want to FastBoot for all users.
Right.
The problem is that FastBoot pages can take a while to render. We have some pages where I'll look in our logs and they're like 40 seconds to render. It's not like every single time it's 40 seconds. It's just I'll look in our logs and I'll see, wow, this page took 40 seconds to render. And
You never want a user to wait, obviously.
Oh, no. I mean, no.
Right.
No user is going to wait 40 seconds anyway.
Right.
But, so I have no insight into FastBoot. I have no idea what's causing this.
And that's because we have all of our systems set up to monitor like our API and like our Ember app, but now we have an Ember app running in a Node server that's like separate from our Rails. It's just very different.
Yeah. And also we don't, again, like you said, we meant to do this for bots. So if a bot has to wait 40 seconds, well, first of all, the bot's probably already disconnected, but if a bot had to wait 40 seconds, we don't care. He can just try again later.
So some of this led to us talking both amongst ourselves and also with other folks like in Slack. Even we saw some discussion on Twitter about basically the best way to think about FastBoot or even more generally the problem of server rendering. And the idea is like, it is weird that I have a node process that's booting up my Ember app in the server and running it. It's just weird. So this is where the caching stuff comes in. So what we basically came to the conclusion of is you don't want FastBoot serving an app.
Yeah, I mean, right now, today, you definitely don't. Maybe there's some point in the future where FastBoot is, there's no bugs and there's tons of ways to debug things and get logs and understand what's insights. Yeah. But right now it's too slow. The black box that is FastBoot is too slow. And we talk about this, but you want to think of FastBoot as a black box. You want to think of it as give me the HTML for this page.
Right. And so because caching is something that's kind of well understood, there's lots of tools for it. Because FastBoot generates a string of HTML and CSS, you can cache all of that.
Yeah.
And so you can have the benefits of that without paying the price at runtime.
Right. So I think that's our ideal setup. Our ideal setup is we give a FastBoot page to every user, but that request doesn't go through FastBoot. That request is always generated from a cache.
From a cache.
And then when data on that page changes, like let's say you update the title of a blog post,
right?
There's a system for invalidating that cache key.
Well, this is super fun, right? Because cache invalidation, as we know, is like an easy thing.
Yeah, I think it's one of the easiest problems
right.
in computer science.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So introducing this to our app is good.
Yeah.
Right. So now there's this whole idea. Now you're serving from a cache, and you have basically two ways we identified the way we think about it. Since we have like a CMS-driven front end, if I click edit and change a blog post, we would need to invalidate the cache. If I also change the color of the header and redeploy the Ember app, I would need to invalidate the cache.
Yeah. So I look at the first one, the data, like some data has changed. I think we can look at I think for most apps, you can look at, I've updated this row in this database and you know what pages that's used on.
Right.
Or if you don't know exactly what pages it's used on, you can you can draw a pretty big box.
Right.
And say, okay, everything down here on all the blog pages need to get invalidated.
Right.
For the deployment one is tricky because I think if you deploy a new Ember app, it's like the whole cache.
Could basically, yeah. Since everything could change on any deploy, then again, you change the color of the header.
Right.
Like since that could invalidate every page, you must invalidate every page.
Right.
So then you need a system to rewarm the cache.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think sort of the next round of experiments here will be, I think we're going to first start with the data just because I think that's easy. The data side, that's easy to conceptualize. So
a data-driven change.
Yeah. When you edit the blog post, you change its title, we know what keys need to be invalidated, and we'll evict them, and then immediately, it's not like, we won't evict them, we'll just immediately generate a new string of HTML and replace them.
Right. We had talked for a little bit, or just exploring all the ideas about a time-based cache, and what were some of the problems with that?
Yeah, I think, if I were to boil it down to like the smallest, one-liner, it's just like whatever time you set on your cache, you're just going to be wrong.
Right.
It's just not going to be right. You say a blog post expires in 5 minutes, and then you have
someone make a change
and really need to see that change right away. And
we've seen this at past places we've worked where it's frustrating because you make a change and it's not invalidated and it takes a long time. You don't understand why.
And that's the other thing. I think for programmers, it's really easy to just say, 5 minutes, and because you understand all the moving pieces, you understand why something isn't showing up. But for other folks that kind of rely on the software, it's just not, there's too much complexity and too much implementation detail that they need to hold in their head.
Right.
It's not their job. They don't care.
Right. And even if we're like going kind of overboard with what we're doing for EmberMap.com, the idea here is as a sandbed for experimentation, because we want to come to an abstraction that would work in any conceivable situation that we've worked before in other jobs or for consulting clients or whatever.
Right.
We should have a strategy that works pretty much everywhere.
Right. This has to pass that doesn't work on all the other apps we've worked on this year test.
Right. Exactly. Cool. What about the actual cache? Like, how will that be implemented? Where will it live? Like, we have a Rails API. We have a Node process that's running FastBoot.
Yeah. So we deploy to Heroku, and there's Redis instances are super cheap on Heroku. So we'll use Heroku Redis for this. I think, I don't think you want it in-memory cache, because if you deploy multiple servers, or you have a load balancer with multiple servers, you want them to share the same cache.
So Redis will be the shared.
Yeah, I think Redis. Redis is kind of like just the easiest, the path of least resistance for us.
Right.
If we couldn't use Redis, we'd probably use Memcache, something like that.
And then the other layer we were talking about is on top of our app servers, whether it's Varnish, whether it's a service like Fastly, and how does that relate to the architecture we're talking about?
So that's another, so completely dismiss everything we said.
Okay.
We just talked about. There's another approach here where you stick Varnish in front of your FastBoot generated content. And you have Varnish cache everything so that every time a request comes in, Varnish will just serve that.
It won't even ask you won't have logic that will say, I'm getting a request, check a key or anything like that.
Yeah. This is all, Varnish is a black box. This is Varnish's job. Varnish maintains all this. And then there's services like Fastly, which is hosted Varnish with a whole bunch of really nice APIs. They let you immediately invalidate cache entries. So if we change, let's say we change a post title, we can just tell Fastly, hey, all of these URLs you need to go regenerate, and Fastly will take care of that all for us. Varnish and Fastly will take care of that for us.
Would it prevent the user waiting 40 seconds problem, or is there more thinking there to avoid that?
I think you can configure Varnish so a user always gets a cached key, and then
if there's
Varnish, if there's a miss, you just give them the old value, and Varnish will go do like I like to use the term background reload. But there's, Varnish will update the cache, but it won't make the user wait for cache.
So in both architectures, you have kind of a worker whose job is to warm the cache. You would need that in both systems.
Yeah.
Maybe we wouldn't write the worker in the second case. Like maybe these systems could do it for us, but that thing exists in both architectures. The idea that when a cache is become expired, you have some out of band process or daemon or whatever it is that can warm the cache without your users having to wait.
Yeah.
And that seems like the important part. That's the part that lets you run your Ember app, which has been architected for client-side, browser, and have it run in the background on the server so that you get an actual fast boot, right?
Yeah.
Instead of a 40-second boot.
Right.
It's this piece is the thing I think that's an important part of this.
Right. Yeah. I mean, yeah, sure.
Because if you didn't have that,
but imagine a world where like FastBoot didn't take 40 seconds.
Right. So you're saying, okay, that's the argument because FastBoot is slow, that a cache miss is basically that's off the table for ever serving that to users.
Yes.
However, your argument is, look, people have been running Rails apps for a decade. Rails has a concept of caching, and when Rails has a cache miss, they don't have this entire.
It doesn't take 40 seconds.
It doesn't take 40 seconds.
Right. So like Rails apps I've worked on, like maybe they have slow endpoints that need to be cached because there could be a lot of users requesting them at once. But those endpoints are, let's say, like 600 milliseconds.
Right.
And getting them into a cache, it gets down to like 30 milliseconds.
Right.
I'm talking like US users with broadband connections here.
And to be fair, like the average FastBoot request of our app currently is not.
No, it's not.
It's like, but it's a lot.
It's 2 seconds. 2 seconds. 1.5 to 2 seconds. Yeah. And there's some other questions I have here, like we use loading templates, and then so I have a question like, is our FastBoot app rendering loading templates? Because that doesn't really make sense. And
right.
Should I disable that? Like, should I say if I'm running in FastBoot, just the router isn't allowed to render loading templates because it's just work that's going to be thrown away.
Right. So there's this idea, and this comes back to what you said at the beginning of this discussion, which is if FastBoot gets to a point where it's fast enough, you could avoid actually a lot of this architectural complexity.
Right. And the question, by the way, I can't answer this question. Is there a bad abstraction with Ember and FastBoot currently, or is
the nature of the problem such that
is this problem just so complex that there's always going to be lots of moving pieces, lots of architecture here.
The thing with if we can get a good solution for the caching story, it seems nice because it seems like it's an easier path forward for people, the average Ember app.
By the way, based on all the other caching things that have ever existed, they all have such good solutions that we'll have no problem with this whatsoever.
Yeah, this will be, now we know what to do. It's going to be a day of work. Interesting. Cool. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
I'm excited to see where it comes out. And I know you had a PR of our site on GitHub, and we were checking it out, and the caching stuff is super fast. I mean, it's amazing to just click on that link and see all those videos.
An Ember app in 60 milliseconds.
Yeah, that's awesome. And even though we don't have rehydration, it just turns out it's not a huge deal. I mean, it'll be better with rehydration, but right now, basically the Ember app is rebooting and redoing everything for that initial render, but it's fine.
Yeah.
Glimmer does a good job of taking over. The user doesn't really know.
Yeah. I think if you sit there and you mash Command R,
Yeah.
you can probably like, oh, I just saw it once.
Yeah.
But most of the time you don't. Most of the time you can't tell this in a server rendered app.
Nice.
So it feels great.
That's cool.
Yeah.
So you're gonna have this in Storefront. This
is already in Storefront.
It's already in Storefront.
Because by the time this podcast gets released,
so next week. So
this is in Storefront.
So even though Storefront's kind of early, we're using it in production in embermap.com.
Right. So we still FastBoot embermap.com, and we use Storefront. So there's a great integration story right now between those two. Yeah.
Right.
This other stuff, the caching stuff, is more like this is outside of Storefront. This is us pushing FastBoot.
Right.
So
right. Cool. So Ember is dead. Did you hear?
No, I didn't get. Yeah, I did get this memo.
The monthly memo.
Yeah.
You got it already.
Yeah. I think there's craft.js. Is that the new one?
That's okay. We were chatting about what we thought Ember's strength was in the world of JavaScript frameworks, proliferated with JavaScript frameworks.
Yeah. So I think when you talk to the average, intermediate, senior Ember developer, they tell you things, convention over configuration, Ember CLI, add-ons. I think those commonly get brought up as Ember strengths. And
maybe if we kind of set the stage here, I just remembered, turned 31 this year, so memory just isn't what it used to be. We were talking to some of the folks on our EmberMap newsletter about what their life is like as an Ember developer at X company, and just trying to learn about, what were their frustrations, what they could change about Ember if they could snap their fingers and change anything about it. And some of the feedback we got was, just the way people think about Ember. I think it's probably a lot of the ways that we think about Ember, which is that I love it. It's frustrating that it's not maybe more popular. It's never been the top dog in the framework space or whatever. And here are some things that I feel are kind of unnecessarily making my job more frustrating with whether it's whatever changes are happening or not happening, or how it feels compared to a modern framework to use or to talk about. And of course, obviously, like everyone, like the core team is aware of this, and a lot of their focus in 2018 is fixing some of these problems.
Yep.
But it led us to this kind of conversation we had, which was like, when have we felt most successful with Ember? Obviously, like the idea of Vue or React being able to be something you can drop in, having a super fast, like 0 to successful benchmark is like their huge strength.
Yes.
And we both think that like Vue does an amazing job of, quote, niching down, in the sense that it self-identifies as a progressive JavaScript framework, which means everything it does is focused on making it easy to progressively enhance any existing app with Vue. So that's like a niche that it's chosen for itself. It's a specialization. And so if you were to say like, my JavaScript app can render a list of 1 million items in X, I'm using Ohm to render 1 million items in 1 seconds. And Vue would just say, okay, that's fine, but
that's not our focus.
That's not our focus. So this led us to talk about like, when has Ember been successful? When have we felt most successful using Ember? And what is Ember's focus?
Yeah. So
and you had an interesting comment.
Yeah. So where I felt most successful using Ember is teams of like 5 or so developers and building internal tools. So building tools for like a small set of users that, it's for like verifying data, looking at data, rearranging data, like the kind of back office internal tools that you would expect to find. And the reason, I think that's how
I got started with Ember at my job in Boston, when I was, even before like I was part of the Ember community, I was just making internal stuff, and I came across Ember, and I had just built something with Backbone, and I just realized I was doing a lot of things that were hard, and the convention story made me just get going. But sorry, I interrupted you.
No, absolutely.
I
have a very similar path.
Yeah. So you had this bullet point list of things that this class of apps has as its main concern.
Yeah. So,
or doesn't have to deal with.
So like performance, file size is generally not a concern for these tools. Like your back office, it's, you know, managing a list of reservations isn't going to come to you and say, hey, the JavaScript is like 600 KB.
Right.
Please drop that down.
Right. Right. So let's get like a persona, right? The apps we're talking about, someone doing, reservation processing, and they need to see a bunch of reservations. They see profiles of all their users. They're using it internally. Yep,
this is a great point. You control their environment, so you usually control like the back end, the front end.
You know what computer they're running.
You know exactly.
They're on a modern browser.
They're usually using the app for a long 8 hours a day, 6 hours a day. So they kind of have it open. They want to see updates. They want to quickly be able to navigate.
Yep.
They're not, it is not the person that's on the subway that's whipping out their phone, opening the app and then closing it. It's like the kind of like the complete opposite.
Complete opposite. Another thing is you usually have multiple of these apps at a company. Yes. So if you have a team of people working on an internal app, you're usually going to have many more.
Right. So this is one of the things that made it really click. Why Ember is so good for internal apps is no company has one internal app.
Right.
They have 50.
Right.
And they usually only have 5 or 6 backend developers maintaining 30 or so apps. And some of these apps, I mean, we've worked on stuff like that. It's just, hey, we have this problem. We're going to spike on something. We're going to get it solved in 2 weeks.
2 hours before a conference.
And then it turns out like, hey, this thing worked out really well, and we're going to use it every 3 months.
It's like adopting a puppy, 18 years later. You're paying for college,
So... But so, you end up with like lots of apps, and when you can share a lot of...
Yeah, so what do multiple... So besides all the things you listed, good browser and everything, that's like, you can see how Ember's strengths lend themselves to this problem. Now you have multiple apps. What are the problems that come from that? Like you need to deploy all these apps. All these apps need to be authenticated using a similar strategy. Monitoring.
Yeah, just setting up the app.
Yep.
Like another developer needs to be able to
write a new Acme internal app. How's the easiest way I can do that?
Yeah.
And Ember add-ons, Ember blueprints, shared style. I mean, we've done all this stuff, and it's like you feel like you're really using the tool that was made for the job.
Right. And this idea that like, okay, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that like your company has 30 internal apps, and if you use Ember, they're all going to look the same.
Right.
It's like, that's of course not true. You're going to have different developers work on these apps. They're going to have different coding styles. But you're going to be able to share a lot of like the deep infrastructure, like stuff like deployment.
And, again, when we were in this situation together, like the versions of our apps were very high, like up to date, because it's easy, because you know how to update, stage notifications, and I know how to update this other app that I have.
Well, it's also too, because you're good at updating apps and I'm not. So you can just come into my apps and update them.
Testing, all this stuff is just... it really is a strong point. Now, of course, like obviously we know LinkedIn, and there's other apps that are intercom built by a team of dozens and dozens of developers,
and they've had huge success.
But there's some work there, because you do have to overcome some things with Ember's out of the box functionality to get it to be what you need it to be. And obviously that's like led to a lot of the Glimmer work, and I'm sure this story will continue to improve. But this was a really nice way to think about. It's just easy to think, I love Ember. Ember should be used for everything. But it's like, really, the way you succeed is niching down and dominating a sub-market of this. Like, you kind of were talking about this idea, what if the homepage of ember.js was like the best framework for your next internal app, and it lists all these things? And the next thing is there's a developer at a company, and they're like, we need a new internal app. Which are we going to use?
Well, it gives you a
the homepage tells you all the benefits of the problems you're about to run into over the next 6 months.
And it also gives you a seat at the table, because when it's, hey, we need to build the UI, what tools are we going to use? It's React and Webpack.
Yeah,
and if you say anything outside those, people are going to be like, why are you going outside the group of front end development?
Right.
Like, front end development has very clearly chosen these two.
Right.
You should be using them.
Right. And what are the things that led to the work on Glimmer and other things in the community? What are those in response to critiques like Ember is big and slow? And again, this is not something that is as much of a concern when you're building a back-end app or a back office app.
Yes. I mean, some folks may have this.
But if you weigh it against the pros and cons, like the productivity of these internal teams is massive. So that's really where you could make an argument there.
Right.
So it's just interesting thinking about, you know, I don't think this would happen. I think even if we weren't to like recommend, if we could snap our fingers that this is what it should be.
No, it's a good thought experiment.
It's a good thought experiment, and it's good to think about what is Ember's strength and what should be its focus and niche, because projects that succeed are ones that carve out a thing and do it well and focus on it. And so that means necessarily saying no to other people, right? To other use cases, to other opportunities. And so kind of at a higher level, we were talking about stability without stagnation, which is something.
This is one of the core things when you're maintaining 50 different apps
over 5 years.
Yeah.
Yep.
You want stability.
You wouldn't want half of those apps to be using Flux and then go back to it a year later and be like, now I have to literally rewrite this thing.
Or like, fuck this, I need a new job.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't want to work with Flux anymore.
Exactly. So that's nice at a higher level to think like, again, talking about what is Ember's benefits. You're talking at a bar to someone, why would I use Ember? That's something that I think only Ember can say about itself. It's kind of interesting.
The stability without stagnation.
Yeah. If that's true that nobody else can say that about themselves, then that's important. Well, first, it's important to say, okay, is it truly a unique differentiator? Second, if it is, let's assume it is it valuable? Is it important? Because if it's not, then that's something to think about.
I think it's super
obviously
important.
It is. Like if you convince someone that is important, then you could make the follow-up case that this is Ember's strength and there's no one else that can hold a candle to it in this regard.
I think we're getting a little rambly here. So first we're talking about building internal tools in Ember and basically having this niche gives you a seat at the table, because now it's no longer about picking the best UI framework. It's about picking the best tool for the job. And when your tool says made for internal tools, you kind of like, you get to one up everyone.
Right.
I think there's another piece here that, what makes Ember so good? What are the best things in Ember? And this is what I was talking about earlier, where I think you kind of hear this like conventions, add-ons, Ember CLI. Mm-hmm. I think those things are super important, and I'm so happy we have those. But I feel like there's not very good moats around those. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We've seen this with Create React App. Mm-hmm. Create React App is amazing. Mm-hmm. It's really good.
Yeah.
So you can't say that like you should use Ember because Ember CLI, because I think someone can say, yeah, well, we use Create React App. Yeah. And then you're just kind of like, but Ember CLI, like you don't really, the moat isn't that strong. I think where Ember's moat is really strong is the stability without stagnation. Yeah. Is that you can get this super...
We opened an app that was built a year and a half ago, and we upgraded it in a day and a half.
Yeah. Yes.
And none of the technologies changed. The underlying technologies changed.
Not only that, but the way I thought about writing apps 2 years ago, like of course that's changed. Of course I've used new patterns, but like the way I think about an Ember app it's pretty much the same as 2 years ago.
Yep.
My thinking is definitely much better than it was 2 years ago, but it's not like these radical new ideas have completely changed how I do UI in the last 2 years.
Right.
And I think that's something that comes from stability.
Right.
That not just changing APIs every couple of years.
Right.
So.
Right. Cool.
Yeah, I think these two things combined, the actually what is Ember's greatest strength today and where can Ember niche down, I think could help Ember marketing. And I think it's like, like we said, like we're not recommending this, but it's a good thought
necessarily.
Yeah, necessarily.
It's a good thought experiment, and it's good, right? To be able to learn how to look at the people who have done this successfully, and how they say no to certain things and yes to a small set of things that they dominate. That's where you want to be. Yeah. You want to dominate a niche.
Yep.
So, cool. Interesting.
Nice.
All right. Yeah, I think that's it for today. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
See ya.
This podcast is sponsored by EmberMap.com, where you can find high-quality videos and blog posts made specifically for professional Ember developers. Sign up today to access all of our premium content updated weekly.